Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, Doug Ford says he's taking over Toronto's Billy Bishop Airport, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Is he right about that?
Ontario has appointed a military defense representative. We'll talk about why the Premier wants an office like this and what it means.
And last year featured one of the shortest sittings of the legislature in recent memory. This year will only be a little longer. We'll dig into the numbers and ask whether people want their politicians showing up at Queen's Park more than they apparently do.
And in your column, my column, I'll look at a recent report on homelessness in Ontario. Spoiler alert, it's bad news.
While JMM is writing about homelessness, I'm shining a spotlight on another major problem, food security. Spoiler alert, there may be some encouraging news here.
It's Friday, March 13th, 2026, so let's get to it.
Hello, my friend.
Hello, sir.
A little traditional sugar to start with, as always.
Yes, indeed.
Why do you have the word turbo on your t-shirt today?
So I am once again wearing the Turbo Train t-shirt that a listener gifted to me. It is about the era when we once had faster trains in this country than we currently do. And beyond that, I'm actually gonna save this for the Billy Bishop segment to talk a bit more about that.
There is method to the madness of this shirt.
Every once in a while, I do bring method to my madness. How about you?
No Premier for me this week, but given that the temperatures actually got up to double digit earlier this week, it was really sweet. Where did my mind wander? It wandered to the spring and to the summer. And what happens in the spring and the summer? People all over Ontario, if they're lucky enough to have them, open their cottages, or as we say in Northwestern Ontario, their camps. Yes. And how do you get to my camp? Right here. You got to go up Highway 17. Actually, you got to go up 469 across 17 and then down to get to Manitoulin Island. So I'm wearing this as inspiration for the days ahead.
And of course, 17 North is one stretch of road, but as an Ottawa-born boy in Eastern Ontario, the 17 goes all the way east to the Quebec border, and I know a different stretch of the 17,
exactly.
Which has no meaning for cottages.
17 North, I think, it goes it goes up, Sault Ste. Marie and well up there. So yeah, it's a good stretch of highway.
Yes.
We just very briefly before we get to our three issues should talk about something that literally just broke, sort of. In
the last few hours.
Exactly. And it's apropos of the discussion we were having last week. Yeah. We were talking about Niagara Region and how the Premier appointed a guy named Bob Gale as the Niagara Region chair to essentially try to make the case for why 500,000 people in Niagara Region, which stretches, after all, from sort of Hamilton all the way to Niagara Falls, why they need 126 different politicians representing them at the various villages, cities, towns, etc. through that region. Mr. Gale has just resigned, and he resigned under some rather curious reasons. Do you want to go through some of that?
Yeah, so as you say, this is the chair of Niagara Region who had been the driving force behind the latest drive to discuss amalgamating some or all of Niagara Region. We discussed this at further length last week, and he has resigned because it was revealed that he owns a signed copy of Mein Kampf, I don't know what we call it, the memoir of Adolf Hitler.
Certainly manifesto.
Manifesto, yeah. Now,
for which he paid about $7,000, I think.
Yes.
So it wasn't cheap.
And now, Mr. Gale says he is a collector of all sorts of historical books, and there is no denying that Mein Kampf is a historically significant text. But the revelation in 2026 of owning a signed copy of Mein Kampf is certainly eyebrow-raising for a lot of people, and he announced his resignation Wednesday night. I think it's fair to say that this will take a lot of the steam out of the most immediate drive to discuss amalgamation. And certainly, Mr. Gale has asserted that the public disclosure of this was in part a political attack on him specifically to derail any further discussion of amalgamation.
Exactly. I think, look, I'm not going to weigh in on this and take a position on it, but I think it's worth putting on the record that there is a difference between purchasing even a book as notorious as this, and you might even say as evil as this,
yes,
for collector purposes. There are people who have Nazi memorabilia that they've collected from World War II for whatever reasons they have it, versus he has it in his collection because it is his sort of operating philosophy in politics.
Yes.
We know that's not the case.
Yes, and it really is worth being quite clear on that there's no evidence, or as far as I can tell, nobody is even alleging that like he's leaving this on his bedstand at night to flip through and for inspiration. This is just not that kind of a book for him. And a generation of men fought in Europe and came home with bits of paraphernalia that had swastikas on them.
Yes.
And nobody,
mementos to their work.
Yeah, nobody questioned their devotion to fighting the Nazis. These things are these things can be complicated and at least more nuanced than.
Yeah, and Mr. Gale has said, I don't want this, meaning his collecting of historically significant books.
Yes.
To derail or distract from the business at hand. And he believes the business at hand is to, amalgamate, downsize, pick your word, for all of what's going on in Niagara region. So anyway, he's out of the picture right now, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and we'll see whether this takes the steam out of any move to amalgamate Niagara region. The Premier has said that any move would have to come from the local government, and as far as I can tell, the regional chair was really the only person really pushing this forward. So.
Are you saying that the 126 local politicians in Niagara region are not in favor of legislating their jobs out of existence?
Not uniformly, no.
Okay, got it. And with that, let's head off to issue 1. Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport first opened in 1939, right down there on the waterfront of Ontario's capital city. It regularly serves between 2 and 3 million flyers annually, but its short runway has meant that airlines flying out of Billy Bishop can't use bigger jets to serve travelers who would like to fly further afield than, say, New York or Nashville. This week, Premier Doug Ford announced that's going to change, with the province seizing Toronto's interest in the airport. Ford will now be in a position to expand the runway and ensure bigger jets can in fact fly in and out of the island. Question 1, can he do this?
The short answer is yes and also no.
Oh, and I knew it was going to be complicated. Yeah.
So our audience is familiar with the cliche that municipalities are creatures of the province. So there is no land that the city of Toronto owns that Queen's Park cannot seize. And the city happens to own approximately 20% of the land under the airport. So the province can seize that land. And while Premier Ford says he will compensate Toronto for this, and I think he's even said he'll compensate them for future losses incurred, formally speaking, that's not really necessary. He can just take it.
So you're saying he's being a nice guy by offering compensation?
Yes. Well, relatively. Yeah. But that is sort of where the easy part in all of this ends, because the rest of the airport lands, or most of the rest of the airport lands, are actually owned by the Toronto Port Authority, which is a federal agency. Toronto is a creature of the province, but the Toronto Port Authority is not, the federal government is not, and Ontario just cannot seize those lands and move forward with this.
This is where Canada is a hilarious country.
Yes. Welcome to Federation.
Exactly.
So additionally here, aviation is a matter of federal jurisdiction, right? Like airports are federally regulated. So is navigation, right? We're talking about literally, like if we want to expand the runway at Billy Bishop, we're literally talking about filling in chunks of Lake Ontario, which will change navigation in the lake. Both of those, just at a most basic level, will require federal approval. It would also probably be the Toronto Port Authority that would actually be responsible for financing and building the runway expansion. And again, that is a federal agency that would be responsible for it, though I imagine the province could help financially contribute if it wants to. So all of this is to say that the Premier can sort of get the ball rolling, and he can box out the city in the sense of, and that seems to be what he's doing here. We're saying like Toronto City Council just will not have any input onto this matter, but he can't really make this happen without federal cooperation. I will also add very quickly, you're going to hear a lot of discussion over the next little while about the tripartite agreement that governs Billy Bishop Airport. We are used to when we hear that phrase, if you hear that phrase a lot, and maybe you don't, but we hear it in the context like of Waterfront Toronto, which is an agreement between the city, the province, and the federal government. And I've already seen some journalists make the mistake that this tripartite agreement that governs Billy Bishop includes the province. It does not. The tripartite agreement in this context is an agreement between the Port Authority, the Transport Canada, and the City of Toronto. So the province, formally speaking, is not involved in this agreement at all. And,
and yet.
Well, yeah, and yet. So we're going to see how that is all negotiated. So it's a long way to go yet.
Well, you say a long way to go, which is true, but things are moving quickly. And I mean, it was only a couple of weeks ago I was at that Toronto Region Board of Trade dinner at the convention center when Doug Ford, as he loves to do, went off script a little bit, started to talk about how he didn't like the convention center. He wanted a new one of those. Only $1 billion or a couple of billion, whatever. And then he just sort of apropos of nothing said, oh, and incidentally, I've seen numbers and lots of people want bigger jets at the airport down on the waterfront. And it is, in fact, the Toronto Star reporting that the Premier's office has polled this and found 60 to 70% support across the Greater Toronto Area for runway expansion. So the thinking is, if that's the case, you're not going to have much trouble getting the feds on board because it might be popular.
Right, and they're clearly betting on that outcome. Now, things are complicated, right? The current policy of the federal government is that no, they're not going to allow heavier jets to fly out of the airport. There's been some discussion of expanding the footprint of the airport for basically changing technical safety reasons, but the current policy is no jets. And it's been that case since 2015 when the then new Trudeau government was elected, and then Transportation Minister Mark Garneau made that decision. The wrinkle here, and this is a political podcast, so let's talk politics, right? Prime Minister Mark Carney has called 3 by-elections for April 13th, and 2 of them are in Toronto. One in University Rosedale, where voters will choose a successor to Chrystia Freeland, and another in Scarborough Southwest, where voters will replace Bill Blair. I think it's fair to say that in both of those cases, the Liberals would be strongly favored to hold those ridings, but University Rosedale is a downtown riding with a relatively progressive makeup and some complicated feelings about the airport and jets at the airport. And then Scarborough Southwest includes like a chunk of the waterfront. And I mean, I will just talk about the part of the geography that I'm familiar with because I live in the riding right next door. Like you can see the current planes taking off and landing from Billy Bishop from that part of the eastern waterfront. So people with homes in the south end of Scarborough Southwest might actually have some thoughts about this. I'm going to just take as granted that this is polling very well, but Toronto's waterfront also has a very well-organized, very active constituency. Doug Ford knows this. He got into a tussle with the waterfront activists at the beginning of his political career. Prediction is hard, especially about the future, as they like to say. But I am quite certain that the groups like No Jets TO, Code Blue TO, there are a bunch of waterfront groups out there. They are going to be using the circumstances of these by-elections to try to extract a commitment from the Liberal government not to allow the expansion of Billy Bishop.
Well, since predictions are hard, particularly about the future, do you think they'll be successful in getting Mark Carney to reverse the previous position held by Justin Trudeau's government?
I mean, I don't know. I will also add, and this brings me back to my T-shirt, that the policy of the Canadian government right now is not just no jets at Billy Bishop. It is also fast trains between Toronto and Montreal.
Yes.
And a significant portion of the current business that flies out of Billy Bishop is exactly those short flights to from Toronto to Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec City. These are exactly the areas of the country that are supposed to be served by what is like a pretty marquee promise by the federal Liberal government that they're going to get this fast train built and it's going to be running quickly. And so I do think there's a fair argument of like, and I don't want to say they are necessarily in conflict because, you can do lots of different things at once. But I do think that a lot of voters will ask, like, why would we necessarily build both a fast train and a souped up airport on the island? Again, it's not that you can't do both, but I think at the very least, they will be challenged on that.
Well, a lot of these things come down to the relationship between the prime minister and the premier of the day, whoever those two people happen to be.
Yes.
And right now, those two people, Carney and Ford, are getting along reasonably well.
Yes.
They had a little hiccup a little while ago, but they're getting along pretty well. So you have to, I think you have to imagine that if Doug Ford goes to Mark Carney and says, I want this, does the prime minister want to pick a fight with the premier of Ontario over this? Probably not.
Probably not. I mean, the only thing more popular than this island expansion, though, with Ontario Liberals is picking a fight with Doug Ford, right? I mean, if you believe Angus Reid's polling, for example, Doug Ford is one of the least popular premiers in the country. And in fact, once François Legault resigns later this year, Doug Ford will be the least popular premier in the country. And so it's not like there's no room for Mark Carney to say no on this file.
And yet, Doug Ford's party has been in first place in the polls for several years in a row.
Yes.
Life is funny in politics.
It is very funny. And also by-elections can be even funnier.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they can. And with that, we're off to issue 2. The Canadian Armed Forces are, of course, a national institution, meaning they come under the auspices of the federal government. But this week, the province of Ontario announced that we're going to get our first, quote, military defense representative. And the first person in the post will be Ontario's current economic and trade representative in Southeast Asia, a man named Bernard Derible. This is different.
Yeah, it is. There's a history, of course, of the Ontario government naming foreign representatives to economic and trade and diplomatic posts. We have a person in Washington, D.C. who just represents provincial interests, of course. This is one of those times where this podcast where we spent a lot of time talking about municipal or provincial politics, occasionally federal politics, and now we get to talk about global affairs. It turns out there's a whole wide world out there beyond Ontario's borders.
You don't say.
So global events, if you doubted that they mattered to us.
Go fill up your gas tank.
Yeah, exactly.
Check the cost of food.
I am quite smug about being a cyclist this week, but yes, food costs too, right? So a few things going on here. The first is simply to use the academic jargon of my political science degree. Things are getting kind of nuts out there between the war in Ukraine, the war in Iran, chaos in the Persian Gulf. We mentioned gasoline prices, oil prices, tensions in many other parts of the world. It is a seller's market for weapons and other military supplies. Canada has pledged to increase our own military spending. We are not alone. Lots of other countries are looking at building up their armed forces, and Ontario, with its large manufacturing base, wants to make sure that at least some of that huge global pool of defense spending finds a home here. So now this is obviously tied to matters of national defense and security, but this specific announcement about the appointment was made by Vic Fedeli, who is the Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, and that gives you a sense of where the government is placing the emphasis here.
Can I tell you one of the few advantages of having been around the block a few times over the years at Queen's Park? Here's one of them. This is an indication, this appointment is really an indication of how much things have changed at Queen's Park, because I well remember it's got to be more than 40 years ago. Yeah. There was a cabinet minister in Bill Davis's Ontario government by the name of Gordon Walker, and he was from the City of London. He was the industry minister, and he was rather on the more right-wing side of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. And one day while walking into cabinet, and I think I was there, he got scrummed by a bunch of us snot-nosed reporters about what he thought of the news that General Motors, which had a plant in his, if not riding, then city of London, getting bigger into the business of manufacturing weapons, which it was starting to do at that time. And Mr. Walker kind of went on at length about how wonderful it was. Anything to create more jobs, anything to create more economic development. It's good for the City of London. He was very boosterish about weapons manufacturing in the City of London. When Premier Davis heard about this, he was not pleased. It was his view that if Ontario companies are going to be in the business of weapons manufacturing, they needed to do it quietly and without a lot of fanfare. And the next time Mr. Davis shuffled his cabinet, Mr. Walker was no longer the industry minister. He was rather significantly demoted. Now, we are clearly not in those times anymore. I just bring up this story not as a means of, embarrassing Mr. Walker, who had a very good career in Ontario politics. But we're not in those times anymore.
No, there was a very a substantial period. Through certainly even my early years, where governments didn't want to be seen as merchants of death, for lack of a better word.
Profiting off global misery.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. But Premier Ford, and I'm not making a value judgment here, but he is clearly saying Ontario is open for business, even when it comes to weapons manufacturing. I'm just presenting this story as an indication of how much times have changed over the last few decades.
Yeah.
Now, what else on this story?
So the other part, and this was mentioned as one of the responsibilities of this new office, the other part has to do with something called the Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank. Now, this is a lending body that is being created by NATO member nations to help countries with less than stellar credit borrow at cheaper rates so that they can afford to increase their defense spending. The increases that Canada and other NATO members have committed to. I guess we should mention they've made these commitments in response to not so subtle bullying by the U.S. government. The DSR Bank has a webpage where people can learn more about it and the problems that it is intended to solve. But for our purposes today, the important point is that this will be a largish financial organization that is currently looking for somewhere to place its headquarters, its permanent headquarters. Lots of NATO members will be vying to host that headquarters, and Canada is, of course, among them. It is going to be the federal government, i.e. Prime Minister Carney, who chooses which Canadian city will be our bid to host the DSR Bank, in much the same way that like a single city would be chosen to bid for the Olympics or those kinds of things. Ontario, of course, would very much like Toronto to be picked to be our candidate city to get the headquarters. Other provinces have other opinions, of course. Montreal and Vancouver, at least, are also being mentioned as potential cities. Their provincial governments, of course, backing them and not us.
I don't think this is a slam dunk for what it's worth. I mean, I know we are the capital of banking in the whole country. But I remember, again, I'm going to go back in history here, 40 years ago, when Brian Mulroney was prime minister, he was sort of handing out international designations of banking capitals. And Montreal got one, and Vancouver got one, and Toronto did not, despite the fact that even then, Toronto was still the biggest banking capital in the country. So, politics is hugely at play here.
Yes.
And we should not make any assumptions that just because Toronto's the banking capital and Bay Street's got a lot of tall buildings, that we're a slam dunk to get this.
Fair. Montreal is an interesting case there. I would not bet against Montreal getting it. France, obviously, a very important NATO nation, and there's obviously a common linguistic heritage there. Maybe Montreal gets it. Maybe Toronto loses out in that case. I am going to say that I don't think Vancouver is in the running here. I don't think that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to place a substantial office on the Pacific coast. It just doesn't sound right to me.
We've just lost all of our British Columbia viewers and listeners. Shame on you.
Also, I will just add, because we mentioned like politics, and you got to consider lots of different variables here, but like the borders of NATO go really far east now, and asking people who might already have to fly across the Atlantic to come to Montreal or Toronto to then fly several hours more to Vancouver feels like it's asking a lot.
Okay, maybe it is. And with that, we're off to issue 3.
I'm sorry, Vancouver. You've got many fine virtues.
But this ain't one of them. The legislature won't return for another 10 days after a longer than usual winter break. That came after last year's shortened spring and fall sittings as well. How normal or abnormal is all of this? Well, we got an email from a guy named Steve Isco in Kingston, which got us thinking about this. So JMM, should we give a nerd alert here? We're about to inundate people with all kinds of crazy numbers. But why don't you tell us what Steve had to say first?
It's true. We might have gone a little bit overboard, but we had fun with this one. So first, let's start off with Steve's email. He writes, My MPP states that the legislature was in session for just 51 days in 2025. Given the historical context you so often provide to topics, I was wondering if there has been a progressive decrease in the days that the legislature sits over the last century. Also, is there a difference when the government is a minority as opposed to a majority? Steve Isco, Kingston.
Okay, we actually looked into this
Yes.
because we're nerds too.
Yes.
And okay, inundate away.
Sure. So I'm just going to start off with a caveat that while these numbers are publicly available, you and I are not academic researchers. It is possible that I have, forgotten to carry a six somewhere, but I believe that these numbers are broadly correct. We did not go back a century, though I am going to come back to the broader historical context here in a minute. We went back about 30 years. So to 1990, that gives us governments of the NDP, Progressive Conservative and Liberal, and now Progressive Conservative again, governments to judge by. We do have some charts. You've got the number of days that the House met on this chart. That's every year from 1990 to 2025. You will notice that there are occasional dips. Those tend to be election years. So particularly when there's a transition from a majority of one party to another, naturally the election campaign season disrupts the sitting calendar of the legislature. In the last 2 decades, the longest number of sitting days was in 1997. That was 131 days under Mike Harris. That year included the amalgamation of the City of Toronto. It also included teacher strikes. So a very long sitting year that year. The fewest number of days was 40, though, and that was in the first year of the Mike Harris government. That was in 1995. But I think we could fairly attribute more to the Rae government that chose not to sit for most of the first part of that year. And so the legislature only really came back after the election of that year. It was so a transitional year. From a glance, I don't see a really pronounced trend of sort of a general decline of the number of days spent in the House. But if we go to our next chart, we will take a look at this is the cumulative number of days that the legislature sat under different premiers. The obvious caveat here is that McGuinty was premier for the longest of these premiers, so cumulatively there were just more days in session there. But for people who are listening and not seeing the video here, I'm just going to go over some numbers very quickly. The Bob Rae government sat for 477 days over 4.7 years. Mike Harris and Ernie Eves collectively sat for 677 days over 8.3 years. Dalton McGuinty, 750 days over 9 years. Kathleen Wynne, 559 days over 5.3 years. And Doug Ford, so far, has 517 days over 7.6 years. So if you wanted to look at averages, actually Kathleen Wynne has some of the highest numbers of sitting days at 105, and Doug Ford has the lowest average so far at 68.
Now, most shows would say that's enough. But we're not most shows.
We are not.
We have more.
We do.
Would you care to continue?
So this is where we're going to go back to the broader historical context here. And, it would be easy to look at these numbers and say, well, this just proves, if you were a critic of this government, this just proves that what I've always suspected, that Doug Ford is not working as hard as previous governments. The historical context adds some nuance to this, as it so often does. The modern legislature generally meets and sits for a much longer part of the calendar than was once the case, right? Historically, certainly, and when I say historically, I mean before World War II, Queen's Park was a part-time legislature. They did not even keep a regular Hansard until after World War II. It was what was called a scrapbook Hansard, where you relied on journalistic reports, and if you wanted the record of a speech, the MPP actually had to hand their speech to the note keepers, these kinds of things. The sitting calendar used to be organized around the farming season. So, you didn't have late summer sittings at all. MPPs did not show up until October usually. That all started to change in the 1970s. And it was in part because the it was perceived that the legislature had come to be so dominated by the premier and cabinet, by the executive, that MPPs, particularly backbench MPPs in the PC party, were starting to grumble about being treated like rubber stamps, like glorified clapping seals, and then new Premier Bill Davis convened a commission, the Camp Commission, named after its chair, Dalton Camp, to look at modernizing and formalizing the role of the legislature. And the Camp Commission made a number of recommendations about changing the job of MPPs and also changing the structure of the legislature itself. That led to MPPs got better pay. They were the sitting calendar was, I guess you could say, modernized. It no longer depended entirely on the farming calendar. And certainly the philosophy was to make the legislature a more important body and not so dependent on the whims of the premier of the day than it had been. So I mention all of this to say, okay, like let's take this back to the sitting calendar issue, right? The shorter the sitting calendar is, the less time MPPs have to debate the substantive bills brought forward by the government, right? If you want to make MPPs nothing more than a glorified rubber stamp, the most expedient way to do that is just shorten the sitting calendar. And so lengthening the sitting calendar was a way of just, by definition, giving MPPs more power rather than less. So this is all to say, we have been here before. If you think that it is bad that the government or that the legislature is not sitting as much as it sometimes does, we know what the solution is. We have been here before. The Camp Commission showed us one way to address it. Maybe there are new and different and perhaps better ideas 50 years later, but this is not an unsolvable problem.
We should also point out that the fact that legislators are not in the House doing routine proceedings, attending question period, giving speeches about bills, doesn't mean they're not working.
Very true.
They do work in their constituencies, obviously. Many of them travel all over the province. Sometimes we have legislative committees that travel all over the province. So it is often an easy cheap shot for the opposition to take to say, we're barely sitting at all here anymore and none of you people are doing your jobs. Yes. I mean, it might be true in some cases, but in the vast majority of cases, they're doing work outside the legislature.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely a valid, an important role that MPPs have. It's actually, I mean, it's one of the things that it is unparliamentary to talk about whether an MPP is even present in the legislature, because we recognize that MPPs have lots of responsibilities beyond just being physically present in the legislature. Nevertheless, I would just say that there is still, I think, the inescapable problem of the shorter you make the sitting calendar, by definition, the more powerful you are making the premier and cabinet.
Mm-hmm. You know what? Have I got time for a little story here? Again, this sort of popped into my head here.
My time is your time, Steve.
Well, apropos of the fact that politics has become very professionalized now, and these are very much full-time jobs now. There was a time when being a member of the Ontario legislature was a part-time job. And I can recall being told a story, and this would go back to probably the 60s. The 1960s, John Robarts would have been Premier of Ontario, and an opposition MPP saw one of the Conservative backbenchers asleep on the other side of the House. And he said to his colleague, I'm going to have some fun here at this guy's expense. You just watch. And the colleague said to his I'm not sure if it was a Liberal or a New Democrat, but said to his fellow opposition MPP, actually, that guy's name is da-da-da-da, and he's a farmer, and he has been seeding his farm for the last many days, and he drove all night from a long way away to be here today because he'd finished his farm work, and now he's at Queen's Park, and he's exhausted, so we're going to let him have a little cat nap, and we're not going to embarrass him because he's a good guy. Yeah. And that just sort of, apropos of the old days when the legislative calendar worked around the agricultural schedule. Yeah. Yeah, that sort of popped into my head.
Yeah, no, and it is the kind of thing that I suspect we would not see again. You and I have talked at length on this podcast about the lack of civility in contemporary politics. And I feel like if that same thing happened today, not only would the member, in fact, get mocked for it, we'd probably have cameras on them.
I'd like to think that's not the case, but I'm probably wrong. Yeah. Anyway, Steve Iskow, we thank you, I think, for that email. You prompted a very lengthy discussion. Once again, if you want to bend our ear with some of your thoughts. What's the email address?
That email is onpolitics@tvo.org.
Good. And with that, we're off to Your Column, My Column. Okay, you know this feature. We call it Your Column, My Column. JMM and I have a little reminiscence here about the columns we wrote for TVO.org. We whet your appetite here, and then we hope you'll go to the website and read the whole thing. What do you got for us?
Last week, the Financial Accountability Office released a report about homelessness in Ontario, and the numbers are quite bleak, to put it bluntly. The good news, relatively speaking, is that both federal and provincial, but particularly municipal spending on homelessness supports is increasing. Governments really are trying to address this issue with, sums of money that, end with the word billions. So it's not like chump change that we're spending on this. The bad news is that it's not enough, that not only is the rate of homelessness in Ontario not projected to decrease. Despite all of this new money, it is expected to increase. The number of people who receive supports through the government that actually make their shelter costs relatively sustainable is something like 1/3 of the total population of people who either need or receive those supplements, because of course some people receive the money and it still doesn't do enough to make their shelter affordable. And then a very large fraction of Ontarians who would otherwise be eligible for these programs are not receiving the money because there is not enough money available. So, as I say, a very bleak report. It is an update to a previous report from 2021. Things continue to deteriorate, and obviously this is an issue that the government is paying some attention to. They have brought forward legislation and some new money last year to help accelerate the construction of shelter spaces across the province. But if you talk to, for example, municipal leaders in Ontario, I'm not quite sure lighting the hair on fire is the apt phrase here, but they really are increasingly vocal about how the problem is bad in their communities and getting worse. And unfortunately, I would love to be able to end on a positive note, but this is just one of those cases where there really isn't one.
Used to be a Toronto thing. Now it's an everywhere thing. Yeah. It's really quite depressing.
Yeah, and it used to be. I think that's part of what is so notable about this issue, that it is not, as you say, it used to be a Toronto problem, and now it's showing up in places where this is a totally novel thing for them. And in some cases, they're sort of having to learn how you deal with this isn't like the occasional person sleeping out on the street in town. It's like you've got substantial encampments now in parts of the province where homelessness was just not an issue before.
I'm shining my spotlight on a different problem of significance, but this one I'm going to suggest leaves people with a little bit of hope. Okay. Because I saw something last week that I thought was of such significance, I wanted to write a column on it and bring it to everybody's attention. And I'll start the story by going back to the federal election we had last year. Leslie Church is running for the Liberals in this riding, Toronto St. Paul's. And she's, knocking on doors. She gets up to a door, knocks, nobody answers, nothing going on. She turns around, she leaves, she gets 3/4 of the way down the driveway, and all of a sudden, on a snowy day, a woman holding a child in her arm bounds out of her front door and races down the driveway and says, excuse me, I want to just bend your ear for just a moment. Don't forget about food security. And Leslie Church, who won the election, is now the member of parliament for this constituency. I'm not sure she needed reminding, but the fact of the matter is she does know there is a food bank at the end of her street. She does know there is a soup kitchen around the corner. There are lots of food banks in Toronto St. Paul's, which is one of the more, economically buoyant ridings in this country. And yet there we are. Why am I telling you this story? Because at the Brickworks in Midtown Toronto last week, there was a get-together of a bunch of people who care about food security, and there was a very neat idea presented. 10 years ago, 2 students at the University of Ottawa were on a school trip up to Nunavut, and they learned firsthand about food insecurity. They saw heads of lettuce cost $15 a piece because the food has to be shipped in from so far away. Yeah. And sometimes it goes bad by the time it gets there, and there's a whole host of problems. And they thought to themselves, is there anything we can do to try to fix this problem? Turns out there is. They created a company 10 years ago called Growcer, Growcer, Growcer. And the idea behind it is quite simple. They have huge shipping containers that can act as greenhouses that communities can purchase, put people to work there, and you can grow tens of thousands of pounds of vegetables over the course of a year that can deal with food insecurity, get people eating properly again, hopefully put some food banks out of business. They've got 100 locations signed up already. They're in talks with 100 more. There's 100 more in the pipeline. They want to have 1,000 communities across Canada with these Growcer, Growcer, greenhouses somewhere on site. You know, maybe a Lions Club will buy one. Maybe a Rotary Club will buy one. Maybe a municipality will buy one. And I mean, you've got jobs for students, actually, who want to work in these things and teach people about agriculture and how the food cycle works. Anyway, to me, it just seems like a really smart solution to a problem that is getting worse and worse all the time. We are 40 million people in this country. 7 million of the 40 million used a food bank last year. Yeah. That's crazy. So hopefully these folks at Grocers have got something going on.
Yeah, I mean, we have a bit of... One part of our brand here is that we are both kind of nerdy. We both enjoy Star Trek, and I would say that a perhaps unsurprising amount of my politics is tied to my love of Star Trek as a young boy, and the belief of or the optimism in the future, the belief that new technologies can help us address social problems. Not every social problem by any means. Some things require politics, to put it bluntly. But that technology can open the doors to some creative solutions that help us address these problems. That is one of those core beliefs that I have. And I love stories like this. A system like Growcer is not going to be the thing that solves all hunger in Canada everywhere, but it can help at the margins, and the margins are important, and I think it's great.
And to come full circle, if you go back to Iqaluit in the north of this country, yes, where they have a Growcer greenhouse there, they can grow vegetables that will serve the population there even in minus 40. Yeah. This is a solution worth following up on. Anyway, and they've got of course they've got a website, and go to the website and find out more information if you want, and read my story online as well.
Yes.
Now, what else do we want to do here?
I think that's it.
Is that it? Are we done?
Time to wrap it up.
Wow. Do we not have any more numbers on sitting days in the Ontario legislature we can add?
Give me a minute. I can get more.
I bet you can. Let's get out of here. Okay, that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, March 13th. Friday the 13th, JMM. 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it. Good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced by Nat Basin, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Should we mention the fact that you did not hear Matthew O'Mara's name in the credits because
he has had a second child.
There we go. Yes. Congratulations, Matthew.
Yes.
How about that?
He's taking some pat leave, and he will rejoin us in a month or two. Longer than that, but sometime.
Okay. But in the meantime, Nat Basin's holding the fort, and we love Nat too.
Yes.
What else do we want to say here? Oh, we want to thank the crew, of course, for setting us up here, as we always do. And we got one more special note that we want to leave you with. If you're watching this on television, it's too late. But if you're listening to this online, we want to say that our monthly town hall show, TVO Today Live, will feature a discussion about digital sovereignty on Friday night, 7 p.m. on TVO, on television, or you can see the extended edition on our YouTube channel. That's at TVO Today. I think I've got that right.
I believe so, yes.
There we go. And with that, until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.